Remember these mass protests that rocked Sri Lanka in 2022? Demonstrators revolted against the then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who fled this South Asian island nation. Reason? Sri Lanka's worst economic crisis since its independence from Britain in 1948. So as Sri Lanka gets its next president, what should be his top priority? Hello and welcome to Connecting the Dots. I'm Unman Bhattacharya. Let's connect the dots of what's at stake for Sri Lanka in its presidential election. See these numbers to understand Sri Lanka's economic problems. In 2022, its foreign exchange reserves had run out. Its public debt was more than 83 billion US dollars. 50% of it owed to foreign creditors. Its balance of payments crisis was so acute that Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt for the first time. With sovereign default, economic growth tanked and inflation was at 70%. Poverty levels had been rising since 2019. Basic commodities like food, cooking gas and medicine were scarce. These shortages triggered mass protests. Sri Lankan economy was in very bad shape. So what did Sri Lanka do about it? In 2023, the government of interim President Ranil Wickremesinghe got a $2.9 billion bailout from the IMF. In Sri Lanka's history, this was its 17th such bailout. There were also debt restructuring measures with bilateral lenders like India, China, Japan and France. These helped Sri Lanka get additional financing from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. India gave interim emergency aid too. Now Sri Lanka is on the road to recovery. Inflation is lower, borrowing costs are lower, pressure on forex reserves has eased, Sri Lankan rupee is stronger, its tourism industry is reviving and there are signs of economic recovery. This was made possible by structural reforms aimed at bringing down public spending and increasing tax revenues, and also by debt restructuring measures. But the country is not out of the woods yet. It still has an enormous debt burden. So why did Sri Lanka slip into economic chaos, and what should the new Sri Lankan president do now? There are multiple reasons for Sri Lanka's economic distress. One is China's debt trap. China is Sri Lanka's largest bilateral creditor. Sri Lanka's external public debt to China almost tripled from $2.7 billion to $7.6 billion between 2013 and 2021. So it rose from 3.6% to 9% of Sri Lanka's GDP. The multilateral lenders lent it more than China did. Their terms were not opaque like China's. Sri Lanka has been a victim of China's debt trap diplomacy. Remember, in 2017, after Sri Lanka failed to service its debt obligations, China forced it to give the Hambantota port project on a 99-year lease. China's lending practices are opaque and predatory. Another major reason for Sri Lanka's economic distress was economic mismanagement by previous Sri Lankan governments. Tax cuts, subsidy increases, and infrastructure spending financed by debt worsened Sri Lanka's fiscal position. It banned fertilizer imports, and that led to higher food imports. There were external factors too, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and spike in inflation caused by the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the 2019 terrorist attacks on churches and hotels that had crippled Sri Lanka's tourism industry. Now note this, China played hardball with Sri Lanka while its economy was struggling. It took 11 months after Sri Lanka's sovereign default for IMF bailout to conclude. The delay was because IMF wanted China to give assurances on debt restructuring, but China was reluctant to commit to debt restructuring on high-interest infrastructure loans it had given to Sri Lanka. China feared that it would have to offer the same terms to other countries too. Now contrast that to India's approach. As negotiations with IMF were prolonged, Sri Lanka desperately appealed for bridging finance and foreign aid to finance essential imports of food, fuel and medicines. India was the first responder to Sri Lanka's appeal for assistance. The decision to support Sri Lanka was taken at the highest level in India. India gave Sri Lanka emergency assistance of $4 billion during the peak of its financial crisis. That is, $1 billion more than the IMF's bailout spread over 4 years. India also offered loan deferrals, humanitarian aid, and a new line of credit of $500 million for purchasing petroleum products, besides help to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. So to sum it up, Sri Lanka's economic distress is a result of its economic mismanagement, excessively high dependency on debt or borrowings, and China's predatory lending practices. The new president can learn lessons from the past and count on friends that stood by this island nation even in its most difficult times. The ship you see on your screen is Philippine Coast Guard vessel MRRV 9701 Teresa Magbanua. For months, it has been at the center of a tense standoff with China in the South China Sea. Since April, Manila has stationed Teresa Magbanua at Sabina Shoal to prevent China from building an artificial island. But recently, it was forced to return to the western Philippine island of Palawan. Reason? The Philippines vessel suffered structural damage after the Chinese Coast Guard rammed into it. The incident left a 3-foot hole on the Teresa Magbanua. Earlier, Chinese vessels blocked a resupply mission to the Filipino sailors on board the ship. This left the sailors critically low on food and other provisions. The vessel's return was also necessary to meet the medical needs of its crew and for repairs. China's Coast Guard has a history of aggressive incidents with Philippine boats. They ram vessels, use water cannons, and flash laser lights. The Philippines insist they had not given up Sabina Shoal.
We have not lost it. We can still patrol and maintain our presence Skoda Shoal. So there's no difficulty that you are saying since Chinese will be there. Skoda Shoal, for the Philippine Coast Guard can deploy our vessels anytime we'd like within the vicinity of Skoda Shoal.
Now let's take a closer look at the Sabina Shoal. This coral island, rich in natural resources, is strategically located just 140 kilometers off the western Philippine island of Palawan, but a significant 1,200 kilometers from China's nearest major landmass, Hainan Island. The Philippines considers Sabina Shoal as part of its exclusive economic zone. This means it is entitled to the area's rich natural resources. For the Philippines, controlling this area is vital for both trade and national security. The Philippine Coast Guard spotted crushed and dead corals. This suggests China is secretly building artificial islands. China denies this, but it's not the first time it's been accused of land reclamation in the South China Sea. In fact, China has built several artificial islands in the area, including in the Spratly Islands, which has damaged the marine ecosystem and raised concerns about China's territorial claims. The situation echoes what happened in 2012 when China took control of the Scarborough Shoal, a strategic location about 240 kilometers west of the Philippines' main island, Luzon. Back then, Manila was forced to pull its ships back after a tense 2-month standoff. Remember, China claims ownership of almost the entire South China Sea, which overlaps with areas claimed by the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam and Brunei. In 2016, an international court ruled that China's claims are not valid under international law. Now note this, the United States has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. It is committed to defending its ally in case of an armed attack. To strengthen their partnership, the US and the Philippines engage in regular joint exercises. This treaty is crucial, especially considering the recent tensions in the South China Sea. In fact, earlier this year, Washington sent the Philippines a powerful mid-range missile system capable of reaching mainland China. Now, this is what one can expect. If in a future ramming incident, a Philippine ship sinks and people die, the Philippines may resort to asking the United States for assistance. And this could potentially escalate the situation. The US must meet its treaty obligations to maintain credibility among its allied nations. So this is the reality. In South China Sea, the line between peace and war is thinning, and the world is watching. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party is losing one stronghold after another. After losing Toronto, it's lost a special election in Montreal. The Liberals have been in power in Canada for almost 9 years now. The humiliating defeats show that support for Liberals has evaporated even in their last few strongholds before the next general election, which must take place by October 2025, but is likely to take place earlier. So why are Liberals losing support? And why has Justin Trudeau become so unpopular in Canada? Let's find out. When Justin Trudeau was first elected Prime Minister in 2015, his image among young Canadians was mostly positive, especially among younger progressive voters. He was seen as a charismatic and modern figure, in contrast to the conservative Stephen Harper, who had been in power for almost a decade. Trudeau promised to advance issues dear to young Canadians, such as gender equality, LGBT rights, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and the fight against climate change. He had inherited some of the popularity of his father and former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. But after 9 years in power, those days of popularity are behind him. Now, the youth in Canada are more concerned about the high cost of living than the progressive policies of a few years ago. A series of scandals and controversies have made Trudeau unpopular. In 2019, his image started declining when he was accused of intervening in a court case to protect a Canadian company. The scandal exploded when Jody Wilson, Trudeau's former Minister for Justice, alleged that she felt pressured by Trudeau's inner circle to go easy on an engineering firm accused of corruption. The controversy was seen as abuse of power. It contradicted the Prime Minister's promise of greater transparency in governance, and this eroded public trust in Trudeau. Trudeau's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic hurt his image too. He took strong measures that were criticized. He forced federal employees, travelers on trains, planes and ships to be vaccinated. Some Canadians saw it as interference with their freedom. It all started when truckers started a series of protests against the vaccination requirements for crossing the US border. Truckers were then joined by thousands of demonstrators, and those protests lasted for weeks. The Canadian government decided to use the Emergency Act to seize the bank accounts of those involved in those protests. Such measures were never used before. What contributed further to Trudeau's unpopularity was inflation, a significant rise in cost of living, growing unaffordability of houses, and a rental housing shortage crisis. As more immigrants arrived in Canada, prices of houses and rents spiked. But it must be noted here that immigrants contributed significantly to Canadian economy by boosting it, easing labor shortages, helping Canada avert a recession and interest rate hikes by its central bank. So this shows the failure of Trudeau's government to enhance infrastructure and services at the pace that was needed. His government is now trying to curtail immigration, study and work permits. Heavy spending by his government during the pandemic led to a spike in inflation too. Opinion polls bear out Trudeau's unpopularity. Right-wing opposition candidate Pierre Poilievre is now the front-runner to win the next general election in Canada. India's southern state of Kerala is on high alert after cases of Nipah virus. The state also reported deaths due to the disease. And guess what? Restrictions have been imposed in Malappuram district. Wearing face masks has been made compulsory. Schools, colleges and other educational centers in the district are closed. Public gatherings have been restricted to prevent further transmission of the virus. It feels like a COVID-19-like era is back. But this time, it's Nipah. But what exactly is the Nipah virus? Nipah virus was first recognized in 1999 during an outbreak among pig farmers in Malaysia. It is a highly infectious disease that primarily targets animals like bats, pigs, dogs and horses. But humans can also fall victim to it. WHO has identified Nipah as a priority disease because of its potential to trigger an epidemic. There is no vaccine to prevent infection and no treatment to cure it. So how does it spread? If an infected animal's saliva, urine or feces come into contact with your body, you are at risk. For instance, an infected animal bites into a fruit and then you eat it, or you climb a tree where infected bats live. And while it's possible for Nipah to spread from person to person through close contact, that's not usually how it is transmitted. Now here's the alarming part. Nipah's case fatality ratio can range from 40% to a staggering 75%. That means nearly half to three-quarters of people who contract Nipah won't survive. To put this into perspective, consider this. During the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the case fatality ratio was around 3%. That's significantly lower than Nipah's lethal potential. There have been over 22 deaths due to Nipah in Kerala since 2018. So what are the symptoms of Nipah? Well, Nipah symptoms appear 4 to 14 days after infection, starting with fever, headache, muscle pain, sore throat, and difficulty breathing. If left untreated, the infection can progress to brain swelling or encephalitis, leading to confusion, drowsiness, and seizures. In severe cases, encephalitis can lead to a coma within 24 to 48 hours. As we've discussed, there is currently no treatment or vaccine available for the Nipah virus. The primary approach to managing the infection in humans is supportive care. However, India has previously imported monoclonal antibodies from the University of Queensland in Australia, which offer a promising intervention. So how do these antibodies work? They target the part of the virus that latches onto human cells, preventing it from entering and spreading. When administered early on, this can stop the virus in its tracks, preventing severe disease and further transmission. According to the United Nations, new emerging zoonotic diseases could trigger another pandemic by 2030. Zoonotic diseases spread from animals to humans and can spread fast and unpredictably causing major public health concerns. Did you know that 3 out of 4 new diseases that affect humans come from animals? It's true. The World Health Organization reports that about 75% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, meaning they jump from animals to humans. We've seen this happen with diseases like Ebola, SARS, avian flu, and MERS, which all originated from animals like bats, civets, and camels. Moreover, diseases spread by insects like mosquitoes and ticks, such as dengue fever, chikungunya, and Zika virus, are becoming increasingly common. But what's driving this risk? The United Nations points to changes in how we use land, deforestation, urbanization, wildlife trafficking, and unsustainable farming practices. These activities are increasing the likelihood of new diseases emerging and spreading. The growing threat of zoonotic diseases highlights the need for enhanced global surveillance, interdisciplinary research, and cooperation between human and animal health sectors. With no cure in sight, the Nipah virus raises a chilling question. Are we prepared for the next pandemic? That's all in this edition of Connecting the Dots. We'll see you next week with more raging issues. Until then, it's a goodbye from all of us in the Delhi newsroom. This is Munmun Bhattacharya signing off. Take care and stay safe.